Hello, and welcome to We Need to Talk About, a thing where I talk about things that I think we need to talk about. Today, we need to talk about the fact that Kenneth Roth is still an imperialist warmonger. Kenneth Roth was recently invited to talk on Democracy Now!, who platformed him to give his response to a couple of things, one of which was the recent diplomatic incident where between President Trump and J.D. Vance and Volodymyr Zelensky, who you can see on screen there with Keir Starmer. So before we begin, I will let Amy Goodman introduce Kenneth Roth.
For more, we're joined here in New York by Kenneth Roth, visiting professor at the Prince School of Public and International Affairs, served for nearly 30 years as the executive director of Human Rights Watch. His new book is just out. It's titled Righting Wrongs: 3 Decades on the Front Lines Battling Abusive Governments. His recent piece for The Guardian headlined, "Even Trump can be cajoled into doing the right thing. You just have to know which buttons to press." Ken Roth.
Right, so it gives you a picture. He is conventionally considered to be a do-gooder, a person on the right side of history or whatever, by dint of him being part of this organization. Now, I personally class him as what I call a HCIW. That's a hero-coded or humanitarian-coded imperialist warmonger. Also, I sometimes use HCIC. You'll have to work out what that means for yourself. So the problem with Roth and with Human Rights Watch in general is that it doesn't matter what good you see them doing, it's still possible for them to do a lot more harm, and for it to be invisible, even if it is right in front of your eyes. Back in 2014, there was a bit of a scandal around Human Rights Watch, with many people considering them to have become effectively an arm of the US State Department because their pro-imperialist stances had become too obvious, and people linked this to the revolving door of employment between the US State Department and Human Rights Watch, and also Amnesty International. Back then, Democracy Now! Actually ran a debate between Keen Bart and Reed Brody, with Keen Bart taking the anti-HRW side, and that was very interesting. And I also wrote a piece back then, which I think introduces, or if I could read excerpts from it that will introduce the issue to you. So I wrote, however well-meaning most Human Rights Watch employees are, and no matter how much of Human Rights Watch work is well-meaning, the organization is tainted and it is not independent. The same is true of Amnesty International. However, preventing the continuation of relations between these organizations and the US State Department will not fix the greatest problems. It is a necessary but woefully insufficient measure. In order to become functioning, independent human rights organizations, both Amnesty and HRW must actively oppose imperial power. They must reject all actions which facilitate attacks by powerful states on those less powerful. If they do not do that, they are doomed to remain tools of empire, promoting interventions that do more harm than decades worth of good work can undo. So the reason I wrote that was particularly from my knowledge of what happened in 1990 and Amnesty International's role in it. Although, I mean, at the time Human Rights Watch was very prominent in promoting humanitarian interventionism, which is very dangerous, hence why it was a topic of conversation. Anyway, going back to 1999, in the article I detail some of this. So in October 1990, Amnesty gave crucial support to the fraudulent claim that Iraqi personnel had murdered premature babies by removing them from incubators. Some people may recall this as quite a notorious thing where a 15-year-old girl who was actually a member of the ruling family in Kuwait was tasked with pretending to be a nurse and giving testimony, very emotive testimony that was later, of course, debunked, but it still did its job. Anyway, Amnesty would later retract the support for those claims, but less than 3 weeks after the incubator lies, Amnesty released a report on atrocities carried out by Iraqis in Kuwait. The report contained unconfirmed as well as independently verified reports of atrocities. Atrocities were definitely taking place, but why dramatise the report with unconfirmed allegations, which was, in fact, Amnesty was going against its normal standard practices in doing so. So it was exceeding its normal behaviour in order to do this. So Amnesty's answer for why they were doing this was that they wanted to raise awareness, which is extraordinary because the entire world was watching and Saddam Hussein was the most vilified person on the planet. George Bush Sr. had labelled him as worse than Hitler. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to have been trying to raise awareness. Anyway, no one should underestimate Amnesty's impact in this instance. People were wary of US warmongering, but atrocity propaganda is a very powerful tool. It is one of the ironies of human existence that people are mobilized to commit atrocities by stories, true or false, of the atrocities of the targeted enemy. And of course, people will recognize this, those who have been following events from a reasonably neutral source, which obviously wouldn't be the mainstream news, will know that false atrocity propaganda was used to justify the Gaza Holocaust. Obviously we have the 40 beheaded babies and the mass rapes hoaxes being the prominent things there. Anyway, Amnesty helped unleash a quarter century of insecurity, fear, death, and grief on the Iraqi people. With those actions alone, Amnesty destroyed its value to humanity, taking all of the hard work of dedicated and sometimes brave and self-sacrificing individuals and converting that into a form of capital to be spent by murderous warmongers. So what I mean is that the credibility they gained from their piecemeal actions in various places became a useful tool for warmongers. And the scales involved are so disparate that any good that Amnesty has done over the years is overwhelmed by the levels of brutality they helped unleash. So now, let's just a bit of a sample of it. There are other problems with Human Rights Watch. So, for example, I believe I actually don't have the citation here, but I think it was it might have been King Butt bringing up the fact that Javier Solana was on the board of directors of Human Rights Watch, and Human Rights Watch had said at the time of NATO's war against Yugoslavia that that they were committing violations of international humanitarian law, which means they're committing war crimes. And Javier Solana was the Secretary General of NATO at the time. So they had someone on their board who they had accused of being a war criminal in effect, or at least being so close, especially in a position, the top position, that it would seem pretty odd to be putting them on the board. But their board is really stuffed full of elite people, financiers, billionaires, that sort of thing. In our society, that is naturalized as being like what you would do if you want to run a thing. You need the successful people around you. This kind of conflation of success and merit that is now kind of ingrained in our society is part of how they choose people to run these organizations. The thing is that, or direct rather than run, sorry. But the thing is that, of course, in reality, our society is highly cacistocratic, meaning that it rewards people for being actually probably worse than the less successful people, the ordinary people around them. And we only need to look at this chap to know that. But I mean, anyone who hasn't worked out yet that billionaires are not good people, and people who succeed in finance are not good people as a whole. No, there may be exceptions, but anyway, we'll just take them as a collectivity and say that this is not the pool from which you should be selecting to run your humanitarian organization. I mean, there was more to come out at the time. So King Butt was debating Reed Brody, who is a genuine sort of believer in Human Rights Watch mission and so forth. He's not an evil person who wants to do harm, or he's not a racist Western chauvinist who, simply doesn't really value the lives of people around the world. He was a true believer, and one of the defense mechanisms he had in order to explain the criticism came out in the debate, because when Keen Bart was criticizing it, he said his motivation was that he wanted to shield Venezuela from criticism, which is ridiculous. But you see that that's the kind of, rather than being able to process criticism, they circle the ideological wagons and then attack people on the basis of motive. So, however, Bart pointed out that there was a double standard in Human Rights Watch advocacy. Quote, "Let's take the case of drone strikes in Yemen, for example. What Human Rights Watch is advocating is not for the immediate cessation of drone strikes, which have killed hundreds of civilians around the world. What they're asking for is greater transparency on the legal rationale for the continuation of these drone strikes. So the idea that the United States can treat the entire planet as a legitimate battlefield is simply unquestioned." And at the same time, Kenneth Roth was calling on Twitter for the US to militarily intervene in Syria. And let's just be very, 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 very clear about this. Not only does the US not have any legal or moral right to go around being the world policeman or global hegemon or whatever. People often suggest that there is a practical benefit from it. They are spreading democracy or something like that. Well, the thing is this: I challenge those people to come up with anywhere where that is actually being true, because I can come up with place after place after place after place where, and time and place actually, where because sometimes they're going back for seconds, for thirds, for fourths, and so forth, where they have gone in and they have wreaked havoc, they have killed people, they have created immense amounts of misery, they have enforced economic strangleholds that immure people in poverty, and just the idea that somehow they play a positive role in our society is, to me, shocking, so shockingly actually divorced from reality. It's an article of faith that is held alive by simple repetition and the slimy love of power that attracts people to being supporters of US empire. So yeah, right. So I think that's enough. I'm neglecting the actual Democracy Now! Segment I'm supposed to be talking about, but it gives you an idea of where I'm coming from in terms of the initial critique.
Welcome back to Democracy Now! Thanks so much for joining us. First, your response to this public clash.
Well, Amy, it's great to be back. I think it's important to note that the segment you just showed was preceded by 40 minutes of normal, reasonable conversation.
Right. So here's an interesting point. Normal, reasonable conversation was, in fact, Zelensky more or less sticking to what is accepted by people like Roth, and clearly, I mean, in the end, Amy Goodman as well, sadly, which is that he went on and on about how Putin, he demonized Putin and said you can't negotiate with these people, you can't trust them, there can be no diplomacy, blah, 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 which is like the implications of which are that he's saying forever war, and with a little bit of pushback from Trump. And then what happened was J.D. Vance brought up more directly the idea that diplomacy is the answer. And in fact, it was Zelensky who really started to kick shit off first. And that's not to detract or diminish how inappropriate Trump and Vance were later, but it was actually Zelensky who kind of veered off the path. So, well, yes, we'll go back to Roth's version.
As this, weird press conference, because it was supposed to be, a heads of state meeting, but it was all televised. As it was drawing to an end, that's when J.D. Vance stepped in and tried to sabotage things. And, who knows what he was thinking. Partly it was, speaking to the media, remember me, I'm the guy who you ignore when you focus on Elon Musk. Partly it was his long-standing hostility to Ukraine's democracy. He favors Putin, he favors the neo-Nazi German AfD party. But
okay. Now, I don't think you'll ever find J.D. Vance has ever said anything about how much he loves Putin. This is an interpolation. It might be, you could make a case, maybe. But I think that actually Roth should make that case if he's going to state it. I think, unlike, say, it's a much easier line to draw with the AfD, I think. This whole Putin narrative is the pro-Putin narrative, with the whole Russiagate thing is quite, it's so well trodden territory that it's not something that people of a certain ilk even question anymore. It's just so obvious to them. And it's really based on a few things that Trump said that kind of, he clearly leaned into saying positive things, positive or at least understanding things about Putin and his position. But he did run, in his first term, he ran quite an anti-Russia policy. So, like the words aren't that meaningful, and the entire Russiagate narrative was clearly manufactured, I would say, is a way of putting it. Anyway, so he's basically leaning heavily into providing motives for Vance in advance, as it were, and yes, which kind of was a way of setting up what he's going to say.
When he started clashing with Zelensky, Zelensky said, well, what do you mean just diplomacy? What do you mean we don't need security guarantees? We have this long history of Putin violating various ceasefire guarantees and basically using the pause to rearm and reinvade. And that's what everybody fears now. And
okay, so Zelensky didn't actually say that. He might have wanted to. What he actually said was he lied about Putin not honouring a 2019 prisoner swap agreement, but he didn't really get a chance to express the words that Kenneth Roth is putting in his mouth now. He might have wanted to, as I said. However, that, of course, doesn't mean it's true. President Zelensky is not, in fact, the arbiter of what is true and what is not. He is a very, very partisan source. So since 2014, there have been a number of agreements, notably Minsk 1, Minsk 2, and then reiterations of them. And these ceasefire agreements have been broken by both sides. There is no... It would be wrong to say that Russia has some specific, track record of breaking them more. Is more often the Ukrainian side that's broken them. The situation that these came about from is maybe something that needs to be reviewed here. So, before 2014, the Ukrainians had they'd had problems with oligarchs and corruption and so forth. And they elected a broadly pro-Western president who took power and then kind of made the determination that the country's interests actually lay more with being closer to Russia rather than the West. The US did not like this, and they basically engineered a coup. Part of that coup was to whip up a protest movement, which no doubt was full of genuine people with genuine grievances. However, it was, at least in part, manufactured. And, there were people in it. I saw at the time people with military ordnance at the barricades of the protests, So I personally have been to a lot of protests, and I didn't notice anyone with folding stock submachine guns there. It's not really. It was already an unusual situation. But then there was a series of killings by snipers, and now a recent paper has come out that in God, I can't even remember the journal, but there is a paper that shows. Oops, sorry, why does that keep coming up? No, I don't have it up there. Anyway, there's a recent journal paper where lots of testimony was gathered from victims and bystanders, witnesses, show, and with other analysis, show that this was definitely a false flag operation. The snipers shot protesters and also shot a number of policemen. They were clearly trying to engineer an outbreak of violence between them, which I assume is also why there were people in the protest with military weapons, who I assume were mercenaries sent in there for that reason. So the protest movement became a coup. It was backed by the US. We have recordings leaked by WikiLeaks from Victoria Newland showing her intense and so it became violent, and the president fled, and the US declared, well, he's no longer president because he fled. If he'd stayed and got killed, he would be still president or something. I'm not sure what the rationale behind that is, but they said that it's valid to take over a country if the president runs away, which is not the first time they've said that either. Yeah, it does leave those faced with a coup the decision of doing like Salvador Allende and staying and dying, or running away and being basically murdered diplomatically, become an unperson, and so forth. So the takeover involved some nasty violence. Particularly, there was a massacre in Odessa by right-wing forces of left-wing people. So it was the coup emboldened a lot of right-wing people, including neo-Nazis, and it was felt well. It impacted negatively on leftists, ethnically Russian speakers, and part of that was that two chunks of two eastern provinces broke away from the coup regime and formed their own autonomous republics. They were Russian-speaking, and they sometimes referred to themselves as Novorussia, and the Russian Federation started to support them. And, this led to the Minsk I and Minsk II, but, there have been times when the fighting has gone down, but I think 14,000 people died between 2014 and 2022 when Russia invaded. So it was already a war, and a lot of those people were civilians dying from shelling or mortaring in the areas of Novorussia, conducted by people like the Azov Battalion, who have, of course, a neo-Nazi origin. So also the other thing I think is maybe worth just briefly touching on is that there has been a revival of the lionizing of Stepan Bandera and the OUN, which was a Ukrainian nationalist organization. Now, they sided initially with the Germans and murdered many, many, many civilian Jews and Poles. We're talking tens of thousands. So the fact that they had nationalistic credibility and were later considered not friends by the Germans. It doesn't really bring those murdered civilians back to life or excuse their behaviour at all. Anyway, right, so going back to what Roth is saying.
Vance had no answer to that, so he got into attack dog mode. Why aren't you more thankful? And that, it's embarrassing, frankly, as an American, to see the two leading American officials behaving in such a juvenile fashion, when these are life and death matters for not only Ukrainian people, but for Ukrainian democracy and potentially European democracy. But this is how policy is being made. And I think the real challenge now is, can this be salvaged? What is on the table is, not just a temporary ceasefire deal, but will the United States provide aerial backup for the European peacekeeping force that would be put on the ground to prevent Putin from
Right, so now we're getting kind of to the crunch. So Kenneth Roth, he's like a number of people who lurk in left-wing spaces, condemning a lot of things in the abstract, but always practically saying that this time the US has to intervene. This time it's a good thing to do. And I think that he exploits the credibility he builds up through these rhetorical condemnations of some things in order to selectively and tactically promote other things. And I think this is a big part of how humanitarianism as a whole is co-opted and used for fucking evil purposes, quite frankly. And while we're talking about fucking evil, look at the guy. He's built up this career as the good guy, but actually look at him and listen to him. I mean, if that guy isn't a villain from Central Casting, I don't know who is. He's got this snaky sibilance, and he has that creepy little smirk. I mean, maybe it's just me, but I mean, he looks like. Anyway, that's probably irrelevant. We shouldn't judge people on that sort of thing, but it's just hard not to notice. So, yeah, I mean, worm-tonguish, I would say, is one way of putting it. Anyway, I'll leave that for the moment.
Invading down the road. It's a very reasonable request. Trump has refused to agree to that. He just, it's...
Sorry, I've forgotten why I was even interrupting there. So he's suggesting that the US needs to have basically a no-fly zone to stop Putin from reinvading. Now, he's going to explain later on why he thinks Putin would reinvade. But let's just think about what no-fly zones mean. No-fly zones, this is a term of art. It's like, what they mean by no-fly zone is a US-only fly zone or a NATO-only fly zone. And what they do is they take over the airspace, and they bomb any sort of air defenses that they find, or anything that could challenge their air supremacy over an area, as well, of course, as banning any flights by others considered their enemies in them. So the history of these things in Iraq and Libya is, of course, very deadly indeed. But also, I think we have to look at it as maybe a potential Trojan horse here for wider US involvement. They have been they've already got forces in Ukraine. They have, slyly insinuated ground troops into all sorts of places. They are waging wars in places that people have no idea they're waging wars. They just bombed Somalia again the other day. They've never stopped, and they they have established a presumption of their right to intervene in globally that means that it's no longer considered newsworthy, which means that people never find out about it. So I think this, what I was talking about earlier, or rather quoting Keen Bart talking about this Human Rights Watch basically endorsing the US's self-arrogated right to carry out deadly violence anywhere it wants in the world is relevant in building towards this situation. And of course, they are exercising universal jurisdiction over people. For example, there's an Australian who's currently being held in an Australian prison. He's been there for several years now because the US decided that he committed a crime by teaching Chinese people how to fly military aircraft. He isn't a US citizen. This didn't happen in the US. The Australian government is still holding him pending his extradition to the US. Why? We don't know. Even the Kim.com case, really, I mean, you can argue because it's the internet that the US has some involvement, but, you know, why? Why are they the ones who get to prosecute people from all around the world? Okay, so we'll go back to this.
On the table repeatedly, and he doesn't say yes. That's what Zelensky was trying to secure, and that's what Vance and then ultimately Trump sabotaged.
Now, of course, Trump also has long-term resentments of President Zelensky. That's why he was bringing up Hunter Biden's laptop, etc., involving his first impeachment.
No, precisely. I mean, he was impeached because of Trump's utterly improper effort to persuade Zelensky to investigate Hunter Biden when Trump was facing a potential challenge from Biden. So,
right, okay, okay. So yeah, can't really even get into deconstructing this mess of a discourse about this whole Hunter Biden laptop thing, which not coincidentally normalizes the idea that it's perfectly acceptable for the son of someone powerful to be given a board seat just because of their name. Because, I mean, to be fair, it's not the Bidens are not the only people to have done this. So you know, it happens, but that doesn't mean that it should be endorsed at all. And also conflating the concerns about Hunter Biden's dealings with Burisma with the Hunter Biden laptop thing is, just confusing the issue even more. So I won't comment further on that, but I mean, come on, they should be doing better than this. And it's interesting that like when it's a certain, when Trump is the target, the journalistic standards go out the window to some extent. Call it Trump derangement syndrome or whatever. But I mean, there is something real there to talk about. When I say they can do better, I mean Amy Goodman and Democracy Now!, Kenneth Roth. Yeah, no.
this is how American foreign policy is being made. And, understandably, the world is appalled. And I think the real question is, how do we salvage the situation? And as I wrote in that Guardian piece that you just mentioned, I do think that there's a way of salvaging disaster from all of this. And that is to really look at what Trump cares about, which is that, and he said this repeatedly during this press conference, he is a master deal maker. He spent his entire life making deals.
Right. I don't know if you saw that one coming, but yes, of course. It's the cliche. How do you deal with Trump? He sees himself as a master deal maker. I mean, this is such a well-constructed narrative. I mean, we are talking about something that was staged as a piece of theatre. I don't know how much went into improv territory at the end there, but the fact that they had cameras pointing at them and everything about the Trump persona, including this "I'm a deal maker" thing, is a bit of a larger-than-life theatrical character. In fact, the whole thing, this idea of Trump as this, of Putin as the demon, of Zelensky as the hero, these are all distractions. These people are not that, they're not that central to the decision-making process, or their personalities aren't anyway. When these aren't even real personalities that people are being fed, they're being made into these archetypes. And, people who are on the other side go on about Zelensky being a cocaine clown and so forth. So there's demonization in that respect as well. This is not a one-side thing at all, but it is completely distracting people from the actual reality. I mean, even Jon Stewart called what happened there a heel turn and made references to the World Wrestling Entertainment world, which I wonder where they get their ideas from. Presumably from my traffic, not from me. But you may have noticed that that is what that is a line I've been pushing here and on 1 of 200. Because it is a way of understanding it, and because, of course, the world of professional wrestling, like the world of reality television, is bleeding into politics because it serves their purposes to run it as a distraction. And that's not new, it's just becoming more obvious. There's an old saying, that public diplomacy is the theatre of power, and when you sit for nearly an hour with TV cameras pointed at you, having an argument like that, it's actually theatre. It's reality TV. So yeah, public diplomacy is the reality television of power. Right. Anyway, Trump the deal maker. So yes, more cliches dripping from the lips of Kenneth Roth here.
And if we can show that, a deal that is just a ceasefire without security guarantees will be a bad deal. It'll be just a matter of time before Putin then tries to reinvade and take Kyiv. Trump has the potential of having a legacy of
Right. So, okay. So the Roth is trying to say that without a US security guarantee, with only European troops there, remember that these Europeans include France and the UK, both nuclear armed powers, both on the Security Council, both in the top 10 military spending, I think, but very high up there in terms of military powers, certainly far in excess of Ukraine. That's not enough of a security guarantee. And why is it not enough? Well, it's because Putin is this caricature, a creature, an animal that can't help invading irrationally these places. This is the type of discourse that Roth is constructing, and that is the purpose, as I was just talking about in making these heroes and villains, they cover up everything. And you see, like, when I said there's a fiercely ambivalent reaction to what happened in the White House, Zelensky was sticking to a a narrative that is very well understood in a lot of areas. That is Putin bad, aggression bad, all of that sort of stuff. And look, the Russians invaded Ukraine. I'm not defending that. That's a reality, and you have to give him that. But he was using a language, the whole meeting, he was using a language that it had all of these embedded ideological assumptions. And so when that's, and it really, that is a language, if you stay within that framework, then war will go on forever, there will be no logic other than to wipe Russia off the map if that was, because the language is actually quite extreme in that respect. It has no room for compromise. So what the people in Europe see is that he was unfairly attacked, but of course this whole thing was, and so do the liberals in the USA. But for people who are more nationalistic in the USA, what they saw was something completely different. In fact, the opposite, really, this guy unfairly attacking Trump. And this is perhaps one of the great achievements of this kind of modern style of fascism that we live under, is that they can put something there that will have people violently disagreeing on the meaning of it and seeing the absolute opposite. I don't know, look up. There's a lot of stuff out there with people sharing exactly the same clips and saying such and such destroys such and such, and then there are people who believe in the other side believe such and such destroys the other person, and they're both. I've seen it done with Ben Shapiro, people sharing exactly the same thing, and because each audience has their assumptions and their way of reading the text that has become so siloed that they can't see it from the other perspective and won't try. Now, if you think that there is only one side to that whole Trump Zelensky thing, then you should watch it again and try thinking, well, what does it look like if you have different assumptions? How does it because I'm not saying that Zelensky came across as quite as rude, but at the same time, there is a lot there to be critiqued, and the fact is that I think, emboldened by his the cult of Zelensky worship around the world and the cult of Putin demonization around the world, he actually wasn't being particularly diplomatic at all. Now, one reason for this may be that this was exactly what was intended, and it was planned quite precisely. Certainly, I think it is possible that they just decided that at that point they would pick an argument. It doesn't look like it to me. It looks pretty impromptu, but it did the trick, because of course now Europe's lining up behind Zelensky. The US has got concessions from him. He has now the kind of pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine, uncritical narrative is strengthened in Europe, and I think it's consistent with the Trump administration's approach that they are trying to actually farm out more and more. They're trying to undo some of the soft power institutions of the US empire and simply say, no, we are the rulers. We are going to intervene directly, and um, you should do what we say. So, I think that's definitely another way of reading it. Anyway, I'll go back to Roth now.
Being the Neville Chamberlain of the 21st century, a man who appeased Putin and made a horrible deal. And I don't think he wants to be remembered for that. So I think that that's our...
So again, like the Munich analogy. So this is the tired cliche again, which is it's hard to believe it's still being used. It should be an immediately disqualifying thing to use the Munich analogy. So the Munich analogy is comparing any sort of compromise with someone who you have demonized as being the equivalent of what they did in Munich with Hitler. And what they actually did was give away part of someone else's country to someone without them being there. They gave away the Sudetenland to Germany without the Czechoslovakian government having a say in the matter. And the Sudetenland was where all of the military defences for Czechoslovakia were. So they were effectively giving an entire country to Hitler as so-called appeasement. And that, yeah, I don't think that these Munich analogies really understand what was going on then. I don't think appeasement is the right word for what they were doing, because it was more like enticement. It certainly shouldn't be used to talk about people like Putin or Saddam Hussein, for that matter. Both of whom have committed the crime of waging a war of aggression. But to say that they did it unprovoked is a lie. In fact, I might as well talk about this now. Russia has been very consistent right back to before the breakup of the Soviet Union, when Mikhail Gorbachev sought and received assurances that NATO would not expand closer to Russia. Russia, because of its history, has a pretty sound reason for believing that having a chunk of geography between you and a potential aggressor is a good thing. It's certainly been necessary for their survival in the past. So they often refer to that being their motivation. And since it makes so much sense and it's so consistent and it's not something that Putin made up, then any normal person would take that as being quite credible. And when they talked about the NATO, the expansion of NATO and what was happening in Ukraine as being an existential threat, then I think that they might genuinely have believed that. Now, some people argue that they attacked Ukraine and two countries joined NATO, with it, very close to Moscow and St. Petersburg, with borders close to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and they did nothing to retaliate against that. And that doesn't mean that it wasn't considered bad news by them. But do you think they would be that willing to take on other war fronts and provoke a much larger European military response? I mean, the fact that they didn't react to that doesn't mean that they're actually okay with NATO coming closer and closer to their borders. It does mean, of course, that even by their own standards, the invasion of Ukraine is unjustifiable. I mean, there is very much a suggestion that, there's every reason to believe that the US was deliberately provoking them into this. It knew that it wanted to lure them into this, and that also is a good reason for not taking the bait, quite frankly. Yeah, that's well. That's one way of looking at it, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe the Russia finally realized that they had a tactical advantage, even a strategic disadvantage, of even though they probably knew that they would get bogged down. Well, maybe they didn't. I don't know. I don't know what they were hoping to achieve with their invasion, but if they couldn't foresee this situation eventuating, then they probably, weren't doing their homework very well. And I'm assuming that they foresaw it and thought that the benefits outweighed the costs, and didn't really give a shit about the human suffering involved. So, I guess I think Roth is going to make that point about Putin not caring about troops, and I do agree with him on that.
Best route forward is to stress that, much as Trump dislikes Zelensky, much as Trump doesn't want to, get the U.S. military involved anyplace, this is a matter where the U.S. is being asked to take a pretty minimalist stance, and Trump's refusal will utterly blow up this deal that he wants to make.
So we'll see what happens, because Zelensky went from not signing the deal, because Trump took it off the table, of rare earth minerals, and we'll talk about that in a minute, to London, where an emergency meeting was called of European leaders. There's even some discussion of possibly Macron, Starmer, and Zelensky coming back to the White House at some point. I want to go to British Prime Minister Keir Starmer speaking Sunday after the meeting with European lenders to discuss a peace proposal that would end Russia's war in Ukraine.
We will go further to develop a coalition of the willing to defend a deal in Ukraine and to guarantee the peace. The UK is prepared to back this with boots on the ground and planes in the air. Together with others, Europe must do the heavy lifting. But to support peace in our continent and to succeed, this effort must have strong US backing.
He's standing at a podium that says, securing our future. He talks about a coalition of the willing, which ominously harkens back to the Iraq War, which you write about in Righting Wrongs, which was the U.S. forcing a number of countries to support its war on Iraq. Interesting.
Yeah, so coalition of the willing, of course, this is, as Goodman points out, the US cajoled people into joining its war effort against Iraq, and this is an extension of what was called the More Flags policy with Indochina, where they took unwilling countries into a war, and those countries would resist, like our very right-wing Prime Minister here in Aotearoa, when Lyndon Johnson visited, made sure that he was greeted with protesters everywhere so that he'd understand that there was going to be no more New Zealand troops sent to Vietnam. So, this is, that's a glimpse behind the scenes of how these things actually work. The front-facing thing is the simplistic story of heroes and villains. Behind the scenes, it's nasty realpolitik. With things shaped by the mythologies they create. There's no question of that as well. That is these things that are taken up as basically public relations exercise actually become constraints on policy as well. So there's that too, and also, in the end, when you drill down to it, you can't necessarily tell what is a genuine belief system and what isn't. Because you're talking about something held by thousands of people who influence political realities, and they are diverse in their reasoning.
Yeah. Well, look, the coalition of the willing is all that they can do. If they do a European Union force, they're subject to Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's veto. So that's just not an option, because Orban is in there as a pawn for Putin. But Starmer is absolutely
right. So this is nonsense. The EU doesn't have a military. All of these countries have their own militaries, and they don't. Viktor Orban can't veto them. That's he could maybe constrain any formal stance by the European Union, but it doesn't affect the individual countries. So he's just talking crap.
Right. Putting European peacekeepers on the ground won't be enough, because Putin will attack them, and they feel that they need.
Right? Why Putin will attack them? Why? He just says it the only way of dealing with Putin is to threaten him so much that he can't possibly, he's so irrational that you need overkill to deal with him, is the suggestion there. It's really it's interesting because it's, this isn't an apology for Putin, who has committed many crimes, but he is, I think, quite a calculated person who doesn't actually do things out of some visceral anti-Ukrainian hatred or whatever. So it's quite ironic. I think in a lot of ways, Stalin was also the same. Maybe it's controversial to put them in the same framework, but I'm not actually talking about them as their own personal qualities beyond the fact that they were they're very much into realism, and they might miscalculate, but they are not doing things out of some personal passion or sentiment. Imagine Putin just goes, "Oh, look, there's some British troops there. I'm going to attack them," and there'll be, the way Roth talks about it, there would be no repercussions from that. It would be an instant invitation for the US to get involved. It's really weird.
A U.S. backstop. Now, Trump's answer was, well, what do you mean we're going to have this mineral deal and we'll have American miners on the ground? What more do you need? That's your security guarantee. And this, utterly ignores what Putin wants, because he could care less about, more minerals or a little bit more territory. He wants to snuff out Ukraine's democracy because this represents a danger for Putin. This is a major Slavic country right on the border of Russia, many Russian speakers. It represents the democracy that Russians don't have, and that's why he wants to get rid of it.
But it could be.
Yeah. So he's literally saying they hate our freedoms. How democratic is Ukraine anyway? I mean, I feel in some ways that, Zelensky was elected. It was a while ago. There has been a war. But in many ways, I think his election itself was a second coup by the US, or by his backers at least. It was designed to prevent the democratic will of the Ukrainian people from being expressed. This guy did not have a background in politics. Right? He's an entertainer. He's a Russian-speaking Jewish entertainer who was popular in Russia as well, and his appeal was mainly to people who were sick of the war happening in the East and were sick of the neo-Nazis. So his mandate was really to kind of end the ongoing civil war and to restore, a more tolerant society without so much repression of Russian language, of Orthodox Christianity, and so forth. Now, fast forward to today, that is, of course, the very opposite of the way he's governing. He's embraced heavy Ukrainian nationalism and right-wing values. Including being bedfellows with anti-Semites and so forth. The reason is quite simple. The thing with getting an entertainer as a politician is they don't have a political party, they have no political structure. They take a high office and then find that they have absolutely no power. This has actually been done before in other countries with comedians, I think it effectively was a second coup, and has kept it prevented the war weariness and the disdain for the right-wing thugs that was in Ukraine at the time from actually manifesting itself and kind of leading to a peaceful resolution. Which, of course, whose purposes did that serve? It served the US purposes, and possibly the European purposes. I don't think that Europe is benefiting from this as much as the US, because of the economic damage is doing to them. And now, of course, Trump is telling it's going to be their problem, and they're going to have to fork out the money to deal with it. And here's this guy, Roth, telling us that Putin hates Ukrainian democracy because it's a major Slavic country that has democracy, and that's what he loathes about it. I'd love to see the working on that particular calculus. I mean, how the hell do you get from a history with incredibly well signaled motives for Russia leading to this weird abstract thing of they hate our freedoms? This is just crap. I mean, and it's crap that is so bad you cannot think it's just an ideologue. This is the sort of thing that a person who's deliberately deceiving says. Yeah. So let's go back to it then.
That this U.S. rare earth minerals deal is more of a threat to Putin than Zelensky. The U.S. really being interested there because of iPhones, because of Tesla cars, batteries, etc. That the U.S. controlling this part of Ukraine would be a real threat to Putin.
I don't think that's what matters so much. In other words, Putin already is saying, we'll give you some of the rare earths from the occupied part of Ukraine where Russians in control. Minerals can be sold by whoever owns them. What this fight is really about is, does Ukraine maintain its democracy or not? And that's what Putin wants to snuff out. And without these US-backed European security guarantees, he's going to succeed. And that's why this fight in the White House, was not just this juvenile food fight that Vance and Trump turned it into. This was really a life and death matter for Ukraine's democracy.
The fact that we've never seen something like this in the White House, you had also so-called, anchors and press people weighing in, like One American News, the partner of Congressmember Marjorie Taylor Greene, asking Zelensky why he wasn't wearing a suit. And he said, this is wartime. I don't do it at that time. But maybe he calls them costumes. Zelensky calls them, I'll be wearing a costume when the war ends. That's nicer than yours. But I mean, the low level of this discussion. And then interestingly, Reuters and AP not being allowed in. AP we know because they refused to say Gulf of America. They continue to refer to Gulf of Mexico. But TASS somehow inexplicably getting in. That's the Russian state news agency. And when the White House...
Right. Well, I just want to say letting TASS in is clearly trolling. But in terms of the changing the makeup of the of media access to the White House and to press briefings, in a way, in a funny way, Trump is really trying to level the playing field, because Biden got to have this completely ridiculously sycophantic press corps. Things are coming out right at the moment about how they were covering for his cognitive decline. Trump is merely getting rid of some people and putting other people in to give himself the same advantage. I get that the style of the liberal press is more po-faced, but their bias is actually probably just as strong. It's just not as in your face, that's I guess beside the point. Yeah, we'll get back to Kenneth Roth.
Was told, they said, we don't know how he got into the inner sanctum of a man who's attempted assassination twice against Trump. We'll take him out.
Yeah, obviously nobody gets into the inner sanctums of the White House without being let in very deliberately. So, this is just not credible. They don't know how he got there. The fact that the One America guy is let in and, legitimate, serious journalists are not, just shows how Trump is not only surrounding himself by sycophants among his close advisors, but also wants only sycophantic journalists. And, for Zelensky to say, look, I'm wearing kind of military-like garb because my country was invaded, and I'm at war, and as a matter of solidarity with the soldiers, I'm going to dress like this until the war is over with. And to have a journalist...
Right. Well, people, of course, are... comparing Zelensky to Winston Churchill. I don't know if I'd go that far, because Winston Churchill was a really disgusting human being in almost every respect. Not quite every respect, but he's certainly I'm not a big Zelensky hater. He has done some terrible things, but I think he is largely a product of circumstance. And the fact that he seems to believe the bullshit now. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he has to. I mean, I remember early in the war, when there's a possibility of peace breaking out very quickly, a senior official um, uh, was simply shot in the head by one of his security detail and a senior Ukrainian official, and then declared to be a traitor. So if Zelensky has decided to lean into the whole we're a country at war, fight them on the beaches and the blah blah blahs and whatever, um, and it, I'm not sure that I blame him. Um, anyway, that's just a personal opinion. Um, you know,
who mocks him is just absurd. That shows, just the triviality of the people surrounding Trump.
Finally, do you think there's a chance of peace soon?
I do think that everybody wants some kind of deal. I mean, at this point, thousands upon thousands of soldiers are being killed for tiny little slivers of territory. Putin treats Russian soldiers, as well as now North Koreans, as just cannon fodder. It's awful, and there is no point in this continuing. It really does come down to, is Putin going to just stop temporarily and then reinvade, or will security guarantees be put in place to prevent that? I think everybody but Trump wants that, and the question is, how do we persuade Trump to take that next step?
Kenneth Roth is visiting professor at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He has a new book out. It's called Righting Wrongs: 3 Decades on the Front Lines Battling Abusive Governments.
Right. So, there we go. That was that segment. I won't show you the next segment. He talks about Palestine a bit, and he talks about how he's a great believer in the two-state solution, to which I would like to ask, how big is the Palestinian state? Because let's face it, this is just code for giving people 22% of mandate Palestine, giving the Palestinians 22% of mandate Palestine at best, and not making any provision for the return of refugees from outside of the original mandatory Palestinian territory. So, for them, because of, again, this is uncontroversial, that Palestinians should be grateful to get 22% of their original country back, because, as I've said before, they seem to think that if you do enough horrible things to people, then they should be grateful for you stopping that or something. It is quite disgusting, but he adds that he uses the word I. He says, I would be okay with a one-state solution that honours the national rights of both parties. So that's all right then. He would be okay. And if it's all right with Kenneth Roth, then what could be wrong with it? So very magnanimous of the guy to say it's okay to finally let Palestinians have their country back. But, I mean, what can you say? This whole thing is set up for an expansion of the US presence right to Russia's borders. It's the war hopefully is coming to an end, and that is a good thing. But in terms of the future, this is potentially the worst possible thing for going into the future, because Russia does have different ethnic areas, and the US will destabilize, will continue to attack and destabilize Russia. and being that close to them will be a massive threat that makes the world a much more dangerous place, you know. Um, and yeah, and the weird thing is, of course, that it's kind of like this weird good cop, bad cop thing between the Republicans and the Democrats, and and depending on your viewpoint, which one is the good cop and which one is the bad cop is impossible to say, but they're both working towards the same interventionist, imperialist policy. And here's Kenneth Roth selling it, and he is like people like him are a key part of the kind of liberal to shit lib to fascist pipeline. They the part of why liberalism is so toxic is because liberals are vulnerable to this sort of exploitation. They don't. They want to maintain a kind of hands-off, non-socialist approach to social justice. They want to maximize negative liberty without any positive liberty. And in fact, you don't get any liberty unless you've got both. That's the reality. There's no, if you believe that you can just laissez-faire yourself to a more just society, then you're only playing into the hands of existing power and making yourself a tool of people like these imperialists, or for that matter, plutocrats, oligarchs. The failure to understand that we need collective action and solidarity, and we need genuine democracy where the people have a say in policy, including foreign policy, is driving us towards the brink of extinction, I would argue, because the people in charge are not the most a lot of them are sociopathic and so unconcerned about harm to others, but they're also driven, I think, by some unhealthy predilections. Musk recently shared something like on X where he was like, now like women are looking for men with post-apocalyptic survival skills, like with a picture from Mad Max or something like that. And like he's actually kind of creating that society, but he's also it gives it. I think he views this as a kind of authentic future of survival of the fittest. And so those are the sort of people who are running things. And it's not new. It's often been people who are social Darwinists, racial chauvinists, people who come out on top and come up with an ideology that says that being a white man is because you are better. And having power as a white man is because whiteness is more powerful and manness is more powerful. And, I don't know why I said manness, but I think I was trying to be amusing. It sounds silly though. But, masculinity and whiteness, and being of a certain age and having lots of money, these are the sort of things that these people promote, and in order to make merit out of them. They believe in rather nasty ideologies of...
Come back. We talk about Gaza.
Nasty ideologies of survival of the fittest, as I mentioned. Anyway, so this is Kenneth Roth, and why I wanted to talk about him was, after he left Human Rights Watch, he talked about Palestine a bit, and he seems to be better, but than he used to be. But now he's back in full imperialist warmonger mode, and fuck him. So, right, that's all I have to say about that. Catch you next time.